Good morning. My name is Darren Mueller, Extension Plant Pathologist here at Iowa State University. And today's talk is going to be an update on soybean diseases and soybean disease management. Some of the major diseases, we're going to be covering sudden death syndrome, white mold. We're looking at some foliar fungicide information, and hopefully let's get started. All right. Before we hop into diseases, I want to do a quick overview of Crop Protection Network. You're going to see this logo, this Crop Protection Network logo, several times throughout my presentation. This is essentially a representation of multi-state extension. And so whenever you see this, you sort of think extension, think multiple states. And so if there is an issue or something going on that's not just in Iowa, but in other states, a lot of times me and my colleagues will do this work together. And then we sort of present this information underneath this umbrella of Crop Protection Network. And so real quickly, I'm just going to walk you through the web page that we've created, some of the information that we have now housed on the cropprotectionnetwork.org. That's the website. This is the new landing page, or the new front page, and it has a little bit different content. So if you see right away, you see corn, soybeans, small grains, fungicides, crop scouting in those green boxes. These are our landing pages. So if you want information on corn and you want to narrow down that information, you click on corn, and then it comes into a lot of the resources and a lot of the different tools that we have that are related to corn. And so real quickly, there's publications, there's encyclopedia articles, there's disease loss estimates, there's a severity tool that we have. We also have several of our resources have CCA continuing ed credits. And so I'll walk you through some of these real quickly. All right, so publications is one of the first things. This is sort of the main, sort of the guts of the Crop Protection Network webpage. If you go to the resources and publications, you can find it, or if you go through any of those landing pages, you can find this information. There's a list of all of the publications that you see. These are the ones that are related to soybean, as you see on the top. And if you click on any of those publications, you can see that they're all online, they're all free. And you can go ahead and read those publications. You also will see underneath the titles of those publications, you can see CCA, CEU credits, and those are the ones that actually have questions that are associated with that article, and you can take those, and then once a month we submit those for continuing ed credit. And so the publications, again, this is sort of the main guts of CPN. A second one is Encyclopedia Articles. And this is sort of the general background information, and this is just an example. I'm using tar spot of corn, but it's an image gallery, and it's just a really big overview of tar spot. So there's not a lot of in-depth information within these encyclopedia articles, but it is, again, you can find this information. There's different filters. You can click on the crop, the different options, the different and also the different times a year that these symptoms might show up, or you might just search it. And so that filter, that gray box filter that you see there, you should be able to narrow down and look at the different encyclopedia articles that we have written. And most of them right now are corn, soybean, or wheat related. We also have a yield loss calculator. The example I have here, we're going to go back to corn, and then I selected gray leaf spot. But if you just look at we have all of these data. We usually publish them in Plant Health Progress every couple of years, but you can find all the information and sort of zoom in and out on this calculator. So if you did gray leaf spot, and I picked the northern U.S. and Canada as far as the regions, you can see here's all of the information for the disease losses for each year that I selected. As you scroll down that page, you can look at different maps. You can look at it sort of graphed out over years, and so it gives you good background information on how problematic these different diseases that are in the encyclopedia, how much they cause yield loss for each crop. And then the last one is one that we added in 2020. This is a severity training, which is essentially exactly what it says. And so one of the things that we want to do is help people as they go out into the field to figure out like how sick are those plants. So one of the things that we have is a tool that gives you an idea of training yourself on how severe or how much disease is on a particular leaf. And there's ones for corn and soybean right now. We'll be adding some for wheat in the next couple of months. And then as you look at it, you can see like this example here, there's a slide bar at the bottom of it. You can adjust and you can look at how severe those different things are. And there's actually that green button there. You can actually do a quiz and quiz yourself. And there's about 10 leads that will come up with different severities. And you can do that as many times as you want. And so again, just another tool that's in there for helping with scouting and sort of making sure we're all on the same page as far as severity goes. What's coming in 2021? We have several different publications that are in progress right now that I've seen a draft of at least. Corn fungicide meta-analysis is being written right now. There's one on root knot nematodes and soybean cyst nematodes. And then there's also, we're going to be publishing some web books in 2021. There's already 2 that are done. There's one on crop scouting for corn and soybean. That's going to be released in early January, so stay tuned. There's also one on tar spot that's completely done that will be released in early January. And then we have a fungicides and field crops publication that is written and it's being laid out right now, and that should be done in February or March. And so as we do every year, we update our fungicide efficacy charts, disease loss calculator. We also hired a full-time communication person, so he's actually housed here at Iowa State University, Tom Nelson. So we're going to be writing some newsletters and increasing our social media. And then finally, we are starting conversations with the entomologists to start incorporating some non-plant pathology stuff in Crop Protection Network. And so those are sort of the big changes that we're looking at in 2021. All right, so let's move on to the plant disease section of this talk. So we have sudden death syndrome. Let's start with that. I'm starting with the acknowledgement slide because we have a lot of people that contributed data from a lot of different states. I'm not going to name them all, but you can read through the list. I'm going to just sort of leave it here for a little bit. A long list of collaborators, a huge thanks to them, and also a long list of people that have contributed, either the checkoff, NCSRP and United Soybean Board, but then also a lot of companies that have contributed data. And so just a huge thanks to all of them. All right, so for those that haven't heard my talks before, and if you're new, I'm going to just do a quick overview of sudden death syndrome just to make sure we're on the same page. It's caused by Fusarium virguliforme, which is a soil-borne pathogen, and it's a blue pigmented soil-borne pathogen. That doesn't really mean a lot for anybody that doesn't work on it in the lab. The picture on the left is what it looks like when we grow it in culture. But you can, at the end of the year, if there's enough moisture out there and the roots are rotted enough, you'll actually see some of that blue pigmentation on those lower stems. And so you can pull the plants up and you can see some of that. It's not going to be there all the time, but it's certainly there some of the time. And so that could be one of those diagnostic tools that you can use to make sure it is sudden death syndrome. Where it gets its name, though, is the foliar symptoms, and it starts out as just light yellow flecking that you see on those leaves. Usually it's going to be in the reproductive stages, hopefully really late in the reproductive stages so it doesn't affect yield too much. But we will see it here in Iowa as early as July in bad years. And that will sort of evolve into this interveinal chlorosis and necrosis, which is yellowing and death between the veins. You can see that really distinct characteristic symptom in that middle image. And then if the disease continues to progress, you'll actually end up with premature defoliation. The petioles will remain on the plant, and so that's one of the distinguishing factors as well. But it gets its name, sudden death syndrome, because some of these foliar symptoms can really advance very, very quickly if the conditions are right for the disease. All right, so from 2013 to 2020, one of the things that we've been doing is evaluating different products. And so this has been a great opportunity to work with colleagues really across the North Central region, all the way over in Ontario, Canada. What we've been doing is at every location, we have a susceptible and a resistant variety. And in many of these fields, we're plant pathologists. We want to get as much disease as possible, so we irrigate them or we inoculate them or we do both. And so the rules for this is that we essentially take any product that has been advertised or made some kind of claim that can control sudden death syndrome. So we looked at different seed treatments, in-furrow products, foliar products at many different timings. And then we also combine that with the 2 varieties to look at which ones are controlling foliar symptoms and yield, and protecting that yield. So the one term, FDX, that's foliar disease index, and that's the combination of severity or incidence, which is the percentage of the plants that are infected, and severity, sort of how sad or how infected those plants are. And so we typically rate on a 1 to 9 scale. And then when we combine those two things and we sort of frame it into a 0 to 100 scale overall, that's your FDX. And so just looking at the pictures at the bottom, the FDX 10 to 20, most of the plants are going to have some disease. It's going to be pretty light. There's not going to be any defoliation. Once you get to 25 to 30, you start to see more necrosis or more of the death in those plants. And then once you get up into the FDX of 50 to 60, you're going to see defoliation. You're going to see really every single plant's going to have pretty significant disease. And then once you get up higher than that, you'll see a lot more defoliation until you get to that 9 or that FDX of 100, which is 100% of the plants are completely dead. So one of the advantages of doing these trials long enough is that we actually can start going in and diving back into the data and looking at different components. And so one of the neat things is that we got out of this is that we actually did a meta regression looking at all of our data. And what we found is that for every FDX value, you're losing about 0.5% of yield. And so, which in other terms is if you have an FDX of 100 at R5 or R6, which is late reproductive stages, you're losing about 51% of your yield. And so, just sort of keep that in mind. You're going to see that FDX. Heck, on the next slide, you're going to see FDX, and that's going to be, so just sort of give you an idea of sort of the yield reductions that you would expect with the amount of disease that you would see in a particular slide set. All right, so that being said, the first thing we look at here is resistant varieties, not necessarily the seed treatments. Again, remember all of our locations have a resistant and a susceptible variety and for our product evaluation. And what we found from 2013 to 2019 is you actually reduce the foliar disease index, the FDX, by about 80% by just planting a resistant variety. And so, it drops from over 20 FDX down to less than 5 FDX. And then that results into about a 15% increase in yield just using the resistant variety. Again, these plots are irrigated, inoculated, or both. And we're really going after the fields that have a history of a lot of SDS, and so there's sort of a worst case scenario for that soybean plant. As far as the seed treatments go, this is from 2013 to 2018. Seed treatments, some of them worked. We had a couple of in-furrow products that worked okay, not as well as the seed treatments. All of the foliar products that we have, essentially, so one of the best ways to eliminate a product for sudden death syndrome is anything that's applied foliar or after planting didn't work. And we have yet to find a product that has been that you can spray from V1 all the way to the end of the season that has worked. And so we sort of eliminate those first. And so from 2013 to 2018, Elevo has been the most effective. If you go to Crop Protection Network, go to the publications page, there's a nice summary of all of the different products and the evaluation of these products, sort of 2014, 15, 16, that time frame. To pull a couple of those graphs out of that CPN publication, just to give you an idea of what to expect if you do have an effective product out there. Elevo reduced the amount of FDX over, again, this is over 209 observations in that first graph, 32% reduction in foliar symptoms, and that resulted in about a 7.3% increase in yield. And so if you remember a couple slides ago, if you look at the resistant varieties, they were double, and so or over double that. And so again, so the seed treatments are effective. They can reduce disease, but they're not going to be as effective as a really good variety that's highly resistant to SDS. Okay, so now we're going to get into 2019 and 2020 data. 2019, we are still just looking at Elevo and then a couple of combinations of things that are not Elevo or in combination with Elevo. And essentially what we found, so the one thing that we added in this in 2019 was we started looking at root rot. So I had another graduate student who was looking at the importance of the role of root rot when it comes time to the effects of SDS and on yield loss. And what we found was that root rot is a significant player as far as affecting the yield. And so in our product evaluation in 2019, we started looking at and incorporating the amount of root rot and how products affected that phase of the disease as well. And so in this particular case, all of the products that were Elevo or a combination of Elevo did reduce disease, foliar disease, and also reduce root rot. And if you look on the yield graph, any of the ones that had Elevo did have an increase. We actually saw a little bit of an increase with some of the other combinations as well in this particular year. So the levels are on par with what we saw historically. Elevo reduced foliar symptoms 30% and root rot around 20%. None of the other products were that were effective for controlling the foliar symptoms or root rot. All right, 2020, the graph became a little bit busier, so I apologize, but we'll stay on this for a little bit here. Again, we're looking at foliar, FDX, we're looking at root rot, which is the gray bars, and looking at yield, which is the orange bars. The same treatments from 2019, and then we added Murtec plus BioST, and then Murtec plus Heads Up plus BioST as 2 additional treatments, and then we also added Saltro plus the base as a third new treatment. And so in this particular case, we'll start with the blue bars, the FDX, the foliar symptoms. The Elevo and Saltro both reduced, anything that had Elevo or Saltro reduced foliar symptoms. The Murtec and the Murtec plus Heads Up and the BioST did not affect the foliar symptoms. If you look at root rot, all of the products reduced root rot compared to the base. But the ones that had Elevo and Saltro reduced it just a little bit more. And if you look at the yield responses, again, probably more evidence of the importance of root rot and how that plays a role. All of the products did a good job of protecting some yield. And so but there are, again, some differences in there. And I'll leave that there for a little bit. If you go back to that first graph, the FDX, you can see that the FDX across all 8 locations on average was a little bit less than 10. Just on the last slide, it's half of what we saw in 2019. So again, in general, even though we were inoculating and irrigating and trying to get disease, this was not a great year for SDS. So in general, what we found, foliar symptoms were minimal across most of the locations. Elevo and Saltro worked, and they were very similar in management for both foliar and root symptoms, and all of the seed treatments had a significant yield response compared to the untreated control. All right, one of the other things that we started in 2020 is we wanted to look at how effective these seed treatments would be under different risk levels, and risk is in parentheses. So what we're trying to do is assess the risk based on the amount of Fusarium burgiliforme in the soil, the amount of soybean cyst nematode in the soil fertility, the weather conditions prior to and during the season, etc. And then what we're doing is that we're putting out different seed treatments in all of these fields that are that hopefully have these different risk levels, and we're seeing how well they responded under these different conditions. And so we ended up with, miraculously, in a year where a lot of us struggled to get plots out there just because of a lot of the restrictions that we had with doing research. We ended up with 62 locations in 2020. You can see the list of all of the states and Ontario that contributed. Each of these trials had a base, Elevo plus a base, and Saltro plus a base. 45 of the trials had the same resistant and susceptible varieties, and then the other locations only had one variety. And then from all these locations, we calculated FDX. We tried to calculate root rot at most of the locations, and then yield as well. So if you look at the variety first, what we found was the resistant variety in this case did reduce FDX, so it had about 35% less FDX than the susceptible. But if you start looking at the root rot phase, we actually had flipped. And so we actually had 21% more root rot in our resistant variety than in our susceptible. And the yields between the two varieties were pretty much a wash. In fact, the susceptible had just a little bit higher yield than the resistant. And so I think this is a good lesson for us to remember that while in general, resistant varieties are effective and at reducing foliar symptoms, they might not all be equally effective, and they might actually be differing a little bit in that root rot component. And so we have a little bit more work to do there and make sure we have some consistency with how we select varieties. But in general, we've done a pretty good job of selecting varieties that reduce disease. But now that we're looking at the root rot, we might need to start doing a little bit more homework in this area. If you look at the seed treatments, again, so this is going to be across all 62 locations. We saw differences. We saw reductions in For both Olivo and Saltro, around 31 to 33% for foliar symptoms and around 22% for the root rot. Very consistent with other years, very consistent with what we've seen in the past. And yield responses were a little bit less than 3%. If you look at that FDX value, it's for all 62 locations, it was less than 5. And so you might be wondering, well, what's going on? Why is it so low? There's a big difference in this slide set compared to all the other ones. In this one, when we sent it out to collaborators, we were asking them to just put it in fields where we were not really certain what the risk of SDS was. We didn't necessarily want it to be in the best SDS nursery. We wanted it to be in fields that were, sort of using air quotes, normal. And so, we really wanted fields that had low SDS, high SDS, low SCN, high SCN, and combinations of everywhere in between there. And so a lot of our colleagues were putting these out in areas that they knew did not have SDS. In this particular case, that's what we wanted because we wanted to see differences. And so, but from this large data set, we were actually able to extract, so 10 of the locations we had greater than a 10 for the FDX, which is sort of our cutoff for when we start to see a little bit larger differences in yield response and in management practices and how they affect the foliar symptoms. And what we found was that both Saltro and Olivo did a darn good job of reducing foliar symptoms and root rot in these 10 locations. The foliar symptoms were very similar, a 31% reduction. Root rot, Saltro had around a 39% and Olivo had a 34%. One of the differences that we did see, though, is in yield, and the scale is blown up here, so it looks like they're drastically different, but there was a 6% increase for Olivo and a 3%, that same 3% that we saw on the last slide for Saltro. And so some of the information that would be very valuable here is, okay, what was your SCN population? At all 10 of these locations, we still don't have all of them processed. We have 2 that are not done. And so this just came to me a couple of days ago. But essentially what we found is that 8 out of the 10 locations that we did test, all 8 of them had pretty high levels of SCN in these particular fields. All right, so the take home for sudden death syndrome, remember it has 2 phases to the disease. It has root rot and foliar, and they both contribute to yield loss. I think 2020 is a great example of a year where we saw yield responses in some of these effective seed treatments, even in a year where we didn't have a lot of foliar symptoms, but we still had some root rot out there. That FDX, just remember, as we're losing about 0.5% for every FDX value. Both resistant cultivars and effective seed treatments work. They can reduce root rot. They can reduce foliar symptoms. But I would say there are differences. And then as we learn more, I think that most of the varieties, if they say they're resistant, they'll probably reduce foliar symptoms. We might need to do a little bit more homework on the side of that root rot phase of the disease. And 2020 is a good example of when you have more SDS, then the management practices are going to have greater differences. We just didn't have a lot of SDS in 2020. So the yield responses were not nearly as great as what we've seen in previous years. All right, let's move on to the second part of this talk, and that's going to be foliar fungicide update. And this one is just mostly going through what we find in Iowa. So this is going to be pretty Iowa specific. So the foliar diseases that we typically see in Iowa that would be affected by a foliar fungicide, frog eye leaf spot is probably the main one. Brown spot would be another one. So crossbar leaf blight is one that we're seeing more and more of, and then white mold. Take white mold off the list. We're going to talk about that in a different slide set right after this one. So let's focus on frog eye, brown spots, or crossbar leaf blight. Those are the ones that are probably going to be affected by that foliar fungicide application. If you want to play around with that yield loss calculator on Crop Protection Network, this is the type of information that you can sort of tease out. If you look at while frog eye leaf spot has been historically considered a problem in the southern region, if you look at that's true. If you look at 1996 to 2005, the first 10 years where we had yield loss estimates, we estimated an average of about 464,000 bushels of a loss per year, which if you calculate that out, that's about 5 cents per acre. and this is in the Midwestern states. If you look at the last 10 years, 2010 to 2019, that average is around 10.5 million bushels per acre, which equates to about $1.59 per acre. So a tremendous increase in the amount of frog eye that we're seeing across the Midwest. And so resistant cultivars are usually available. They are there, but I'd say frog eye has quickly become a main target for foliar fungicides really across the U.S. and here in Iowa. The problem with that is that fungicide resistance could be an issue. And so we know that we have resistant strains to the Cercospora saugina, which is the frog eye leaf spot pathogen. We also have resistant strains to Septoria glycines here in Iowa. And those are in 2017 and 2018. In 2019, we did a survey, and so all of the counties that are red are the ones that we have confirmed frog eye leaf spot resistance. If you're in one of those counties that's gray, that doesn't get you off of the hook. To date, we've tested about 100 isolates in the last couple of years for frog eye leaf spot resistance, and 100% of them have come back as resistant. And so if you see a gray box or a gray county there, that just means we haven't tested an isolate in that county. And so sort of stay tuned, or it probably is safer to assume if you have frog eye leaf spot in Iowa, it's probably resistant to the QOI or the strobilurin fungicides. All right, so what does that mean? If you look at our statewide fungicide trial, for those that are not familiar with it, we have it at 7 locations every year. There's 3 farms in the northern tier, this here in central Iowa, and then 3 farms in the southern tier. I'm going to go back to 2018 because that's when we had a lot of frog eye. And this is just a piano graph of all of the different treatments that are out there, just to give you an idea of what we found. 89% were positive. 77% of them had over a 2 bushel yield response, and on average, it was around 4.2 bushels across all of the products, effective, or it didn't matter which ones they were. So compare that to 2020 when we had a lot less rain, and the average across all of them was 1.4. 69% were positive, and the frequency of them being over 2 bushels was 53%. So you can see the numbers dropped. The average across all the treatments dropped. And so that's just a reality of having less disease because we had a lot less rain. It was not a year where we had a lot of frog eye or brown spot or any foliar diseases here in Iowa. I'm going to go back to 2019 to sort of prove this next point. We had a nice inoculated trial where we looked at frog eye leaf spot. Headline is that was going to be a QOI or a strobilurin alone, so that one we don't expect it to work because we're using a resistant strain. And then if you look at all of the other products, I'm not going to go through all of them, but the main point is that there's a drastic difference between all of those other products. Some of them are only reducing 40% of the disease. Some of them are reducing 80, 90% of the disease. And so how can you find out which products work? I'd say that's sort of one of the main points of this talk would be to, if you're going to be considering a foliar fungicide, do your homework. Make sure it is a product that is going to be working on the pathogens that we see here in Iowa, which would be frog eye, brown spot, and Cercospora. And so you can go to Crop Protection Network. Again, I'm going to drag you back to that webpage. If you go to publications, and you did a search for fungicides, you would see that there are fungicide efficacy charts for corn and soybean and for wheat. And so you can dive into that. So what does it look like? You can't really see all this information, but it's essentially any disease that could be affected by a fungicide. We sit around the room, we look at all of our data, and we come up with ratings that would be appropriate with the data that we have. So a quick summary for foliar fungicides. Resistance is an issue. It's widespread. I think that for those that have heard me talk before, that's not a big surprise. And we also have resistant strains to brown spot. In Iowa, Cercospora leaf blight pathogen has not been confirmed in Iowa, but it has been confirmed in other states. It's something that we are testing. We did collect some leaves this year, and we're trying to get those tested, but that's still not done. But I would just make it safe to assume if you have any of these pathogens here in Iowa, it's probably a safe bet to start managing them, assuming you have resistance or you will be developing resistance shortly. And then this is a good year where fungicides are more useful in years where there's humidity and rainfall and disease that would follow that humidity and rainfall. And in a year where we have very low levels of disease, we just don't see as much of a benefit using these foliar fungicides. All right, so let's shift to the third part of the talk, white mold. And so this is, again, is a regional, so this is North Central, NCSRP, North Central Soybean Research Program, and a little bit of data from United Soybean Board, where we are looking at sort of management of white mold and trying to tackle it sort of on a regional basis. This is all led by Damon Smith up at University of Wisconsin, but also Michigan State, Marty Chilvers, and Darcy Telenko at Purdue contributed to this data set. Again, Crop Protection Network, go to publications. You can find a summary of all of the meta-analysis if you want it, and then how well some of these products worked historically. I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to dive into 2020 data, and I'm just going to focus on Wisconsin. So although I did have this same data set out in a couple of locations in Iowa, we had very, very low or no disease at both of our locations. And so, and this one's very busy. We're not going to focus on this one. I've actually split this slide up into several different ones, focusing on 3 different questions that we're looking at. The first one is, how do early season applications affect white mold? And so we have a couple of new products that are becoming available that we wanted to test. We also had some data out of Arizona and some other states that were not in the Midwest that were looking at Endura and how well it managed white mold in other crops like lettuce and things like that. And they were actually spraying it on the soil and looking at how it affected the epithelial development, or the mushroom that's going to produce the spores. And so we wanted to look at those early applications of Endura. And then we had a couple of sort of mid-vegetative applications of Lucento, and then also Cobra, which is the herbicide. And so if you look at the orange bars, that's white mold. Really no differences for any of the products except for Cobra at V4, V5 that did reduce white mold. And if you look at yield response, there's really no yield responses across any of them. Cobra had a little bit of an increase. And then our positive control, we used Endura R1, R3, and that one did, really none of these products held up to that our positive control. Now, the second question is based on timing. And so I'd say this is sort of like the history lesson for me is when I was a graduate student studying white mold, or even at early career, I would say that we sort of preached R1 application is the most important, and because you needed to get it out there, you needed to be controlling or getting the product out on the flowers or before the flowering, and to protect those flowers. But really what we've seen, if you go back to that Crop Protection Network article, what we're seeing is that efficacy of fungicides really is broader than just R1. And so what we did is we put Endura out at different locations. We have a couple of repeat treatments in there, that soil applied and V2, V3. Again, that's the same as the last slide. Those didn't work, but we also had R1 followed by Preaxor. We had R3 using drop nozzles. We had R3, and then we had again our R1 plus R3 control. And what we found really was that R3 application in this particular field was the most effective. And so if you look at the amount of disease and the yield response, that R3 application of Endura was really what's driving both of those. A little bit less effective was Preaxor at R3 compared to Endura. And then also we controlled white mold with the drop nozzles, but we didn't see as much of a yield response using that drop nozzle. All right, the third way to look at this slide set, or sort of a subsection of this slide set, is to look at Cobra. And so this is one of those products that I've always been intrigued with, because it is a product that actually does a good job of reducing white mold, but we tend to see some kind of yield hit with it whenever we use it. And so that might be because we're burning the canopy, or it's not really being used as a herbicide, it's being used as a fungicide a little bit later than it should be used. But we do see a good reduction with this disease. And so with this herbicide. So one of the things that we wanted to look at was, can we actually start applying it earlier and then combine it with a couple of different products? And so we have the controls in there, but the 2 products we looked at were Endura and then Oxidate. And so if you look at the white mold, really Oxidate, even applied 3 times, did not do a good job of reducing the amount of white mold. But Cobra did a good job of it, especially when it was combined with Endura at that R3 application following it. But if you look at the yield responses, the blue bars, Again, we're seeing just a little bit lower yields when we're applying Cobra compared to Endura alone or Endura, those one or two applications of Endura. So something to continue to play with if you can just use it in parts of a field or in patches or in fields that are really, really high levels of white mold. This is still an option, but in fields that have sort of moderate levels, I would say I would lean away from using a product like Cobra where you might see that yield loss. All right, so back to timing though, one of the things that we really are trying to get at is R1 timing might not be the best all the time. And so there is this product, Sporecaster. A lot of you are familiar with it. This was developed again at the University of Wisconsin, and it's essentially picking or predicting the risk in a particular field. And it's basing it on when are the apothecia, those mushrooms, developing and producing the inoculum. And so it looks like it's doing a good job of making predictions in Wisconsin and Michigan and in other states. We've tested it, and there's definitely some locations in Iowa where it looks pretty good, but then there's parts of the state where that prediction is sort of faltering. And so I'll use 2019 as an example. We had a lot of white mold up in northwest Iowa, and we had a lot of graphs that looks like this. And I'm not going to dive in too deeply into this graph, but essentially it's showing that this particular field was low risk, and it happened to actually have quite a bit of white mold. And so one of the things that we've been doing, and we talked about this actually last year, is reevaluating the models, looking at changing the parameters. Probably most importantly, they're swapping out the weather source, and we're going to be improving that accuracy a little bit. And so I think one of the consequences of COVID in 2020 is that we did not have time. The postdoc that was working on this at the University of Wisconsin didn't have time to look at some of the Iowa issues, and so that program is happening now. And sort of stay tuned over the next several months to see what kind of improvements are being made for that particular app for Iowa. All right, I'm going to end with red crown rot. And so this is a disease that we actually haven't discovered or at least confirmed in Iowa, but I wanted to give you a heads up because my colleague over in Illinois, Nathan Klacheski, has discovered it, and it's pretty darn close to Iowa. In fact, it's been confirmed in 4 different counties. Madison, Pike, and St. Clair are all on the Mississippi River, and so far western Iowa. And then it took a big jump, and it actually was discovered in Douglas, which is over in eastern Illinois. And so it does have that potential it looks like it's to be sort of moving and not just being confined to that river bottom. And so this particular disease looks a lot like SDS and brown stem rot or stem canker. It has the same classic interveinal chlorosis and necrosis, but there are a lot of different clues once you start looking at the stems and getting into that field. And so if you split the stems, you'll see that gray pith discoloration in that pith tissue in the lower stem. You would also see red discoloration in the lower stems on the outer stems. And so you'll see these are the red growth. This is the perithecia at the base. And so just wanted to give you a couple of slides on what it looks like, and just an encouragement that if you do see this, to please get in touch with us and let us know so we can sort of get an idea of how widespread or if it is here in Iowa. And so again, sort of a combination of Phytophthora and SDS, where it has those SDS symptoms, but you also see some adult plants sort of prematurely dying or sort of having that premature death. And so that's sort of what the zoomed out picture. But then as you zoom in again, interveinal chlorosis is what you see on that left picture. That red growth in the lower stem is what you see in that middle picture. And then you see sort of that fungal, the perithecia, the fungal growth on that right picture. And so again, not confirmed in Iowa, but really close. And so just a heads up, if you have seen it, I would encourage you to reach out to us and let us know. And so with that, a huge thank you. I know there's a lot of information here. We covered SDS, we covered fungicides, we covered white mold. We introduced a new disease, red crown rot. We also talked about the crop protection network. If there's any questions, you can always reach out to me. Here's my email, and follow me on Twitter. With that, thanks again.